Hello, folks. Welcome to Walking on the Weene Side and It Matters Radio. Today I have a wonderful guest. His name is Ptrick Gabridge, and he is an author, and he has been on the show before discussing a wonderful book he wrote called Steering to Freedom. But today we're going to be talking about another side of his writing besides novels. We're going to be talking about Ptrick Gabridge, the playwright. And I am just so excited. I've read recently 4 of Ptrick's many plays. He has many more than the 4, but I have read 4 that he was kind enough to send me. And I have to say, I found them fascinating. Now, Ptrick, I don't know if you only write expository plays, because those are the 4 that you sent me, but is that your general orientation in playwriting?
So I would say it's a large part of my practice in terms of, I don't know, large. Probably about half of what I write is historically based, but I also write a lot of contemporary theater. So yeah, we were just focusing on historical stuff. But yeah, I have a historical play that I was developing. A contemporary play I was developing this summer out at Seven Devils Workshop in Idaho, and I do, yeah, so it's half and half.
Uh-huh. Well, you knew, though, that I love ideas and history. And, of course, one of the ones you did send me, it was contemporary. It was a wonderful play about entanglement and the theory of entanglement.
Right.
Yeah. And I actually understood more from it. When I say expository, that's a positive, because if I learn something, I'm happy.
Good. That means that play was a success. Yeah, actually, that play, Both and, was just playing at the MIT Museum. We was there for about 4 months on selected weekends, and that was a really interesting project in that it was part of a big National Science Foundation grant that. There's a big experiment being done around entanglement, and part of the public outreach for that, they'd ended up deciding to do it as a play and a museum exhibit. So the museum has worked a number of times with a theater nearby, the Central Square Theater, and I've worked with them before. So they came to me and said, hey, would you like to write a play about quantum entanglement? And I said, okay, I don't know what that is, but we'll figure it out. Yeah. And so it was a great challenge. It's very, very challenging material, but that was part of kind of the thesis of the play, actually, is that this stuff is really hard, and it's okay if you don't understand it.
Changes our understanding of the world. Maybe we ought to explain very briefly what quantum entanglement is, but we're, in a sense, taking part in it right now, because you and I are subtly going to change. I have already subtly changed one another, and in ways that now when you write a new play or you do something new, I probably will hear about it. I'm much more likely to hear about it, and hopefully vice versa. So that's a kind of a, hey, fellow electron.
Yeah, that's a form of entanglement, sure. Quantum entanglement is when we say it's possible to make 2 particles related to each other, and once those particles are related, no matter how far apart they are, those particles can be somewhere across the universe or across the room. If you ask a specific question of one, you will instantly know the answer of the other. Yes. That's really the interesting and tricky and really weird thing that Einstein didn't like, because it would seem to happen all at once, and so that would seem to imply that there is information being communicated faster than the speed of light. We don't know how or why it works. We just keep proving that it does work, and that's what this experiment was doing, was proving that a little more in some really interesting ways. And so my job was to write a play about entanglement, but also a little bit about the experiment. Just give people. It's funny, like, entanglement is a thing where if you start hearing about it now, you've heard it in the play, in the news in the next year, you will realize that it is very much in the forefront of science, and you'll hear little stories and articles about it, and you go, oh, wow, yeah, I heard about this. Yeah. But it's very hard to write a play about quantum physics. And it had to be 20 minutes. It had to be able to be done in a museum. And I am doing a lot more of that, and that is I'm doing site-specific work and working with institutions and museums, creating work that isn't necessarily done in a traditional theater space. And I've always been interested in that, but that's much more a focus of me professionally right now.
Yeah, and of course, just one more thing. I have seen entanglement recently in the news because it is one of the approaches that is being taken to blocking hacking of information on computers. Because if you have two computers that are entangled, you don't have to use the internet for them to communicate. Is the theory anyway?
Right. Well, the way quantum encryption uses entanglement, what it really does is it sends some streams. You're sending a bunch of information, but some of the key encryption information is entangled, and what it means is that you can't spy on somebody's information without them knowing it. That's kind of the tricky thing about quantum encryption, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting and bizarre thing, and it was fun to write about. Right. But like the other museum play I have that has one more week to go, we start Wednesday with our last week, is a play called Blood on the Snow, and that's been super fun. It's a project that we started that first was produced last year. It sold out before we even opened, and then this year we had a 12-week run. And this is a play about the day after the Boston Massacre in 1770.
Right. And what site are you playing that at?
So this is at the Old State House in Boston, which is the classic building right outside where the Boston Massacre took place. Yeah. The play itself is being done in the room where this meeting took place 250 years ago.
Oh, well, I wish I were in town so I could see it. I've read it, obviously. And again, I thought, wow, this is so personally relevant to me as a New Englander, as somebody who grew up in Boston and Maine.
Yeah, and it's been a really amazing experience for us, I think, in terms of it's a very intimate experience for the audience, in that they're right there. We seat about 50 at a time, so it's a pretty small room, but you're right there with the action happening all around you, and you really lose track. And I've seen the show many, many, many times, but you kind of lose track that you're watching a play, and it just feels like, wow, this is really happening right now. Yeah. It's a play that, even though it's in history, it's a play that feels very contemporarily relevant, in that it's talking about government response to violence and protests and these sorts of things that was very relevant a year ago with the political situation that's going on, and it feels very relevant this very day.
It raises a question as to whether pulling back by government is maybe not more often the appropriate response than trying to suppress.
Right. Well, it was interesting, though. That's one lesson you could take away from it. Certainly, the lesson that you should take away from this play and that meeting is that negotiation and listening to both sides is really important. I think that is very clear. And, in this particular case, what Hutchinson did was he managed to arrange for the British troops to be removed from Boston at that time. And that saved a lot of bloodshed and, protected the peace for a while. For a while, for a while. Both sides learned some important lessons from that. And they maybe both learned opposite lessons. Hutchinson's lesson that he took away was next time, don't give in. And the side that the lesson the Patriots learned was next time, push harder. And then we end up with the Boston Tea Party, and then we end up with the American Revolutionary War. But this is a particularly interesting play, and that happens at a moment of great import for political history for our country that isn't known because they were so successful in averting catastrophe that moment.
Yeah, and then later major battles occurred. So the only thing most people still remember about the Boston Massacre was that John Adams went on to defend the British soldiers. Of course, that was one thing we were taught, because in New England anyway, in school, because it made him a great hero, because he stood for justice rather than revenge.
Right.
And The other thing more recently is that the role of a black person in it. Yeah. But it is actually a very powerful moment in the colonial history where you have these two forces, and you raise a fascinating, I think, question in that play. Historical question, factual question. The bell in the night. That's such a powerful, powerful image. You want to talk about the bell in the night a bit?
Right. So this is a really interesting question about the Boston Massacre, and that's that when the massacre begins, or if you want to call it a massacre, when the event, we'll call it the unfortunate event for now.
Okay.
Massacre is a term of politics, really, that comes about a little later. But when that event happens that night, we call it the Boston Massacre. The fire bells were ringing, and that was drawing people out into the streets because at that time there was no fire department. So if there was a fire, houses, you ring the fire bells, people bring out their buckets, and everybody tries to put out the fire before the whole city burns down. It's pretty important.
Yeah.
That night, though, it was clear when people were coming out into the streets with their buckets, only half of them had buckets, and the other half had sticks and swords and knives. And so those people were looking for a fight.
Right.
So the question is, so it makes it seem like somebody rang those bells on purpose. It was a signal to gather to do some sort of mayhem, whether it was to attack the sentry at the custom house is up for debate even now after all these years, but certainly some sort of fight was being called to order. And there have been brawls around Boston that week and a great amount of political unrest over the previous 2 years, and then there had been a spasm of violence only a week or two before where a young boy, Snyder boy, was shot in response. There was a British sympathizer who was tussling with a mob, and he went to his house, and they were surrounded his house, and he fired into the crowd and killed somebody. So he killed a young boy. And so there had been, only a week prior to this, a giant funeral procession. So tensions were very high. But yeah, the bells, big mystery.
Bell in the middle of the night. And we'll be right back talking with our great guest today, Ptrick Gabridge.
All the shit jobs come to me. What the fuck are you doing? Supposed to wash up all the blood. The whole square is full of it. Supposed to. Mr. Darling said, clean up the blood and the brains from the snow. He got word directly from Hutchinson himself. So now you're on the side of the bloody lobsters. They shot a dozen men of Boston last night. It's my job. I hate the soldiers just as much as anyone. You think I want to be out here doing this? Leave it! It's everywhere, Sam! They can shoot us at night. Paint the sidewalks with our blood. But fuck them if they think they could just wash it away. I have to eat. The Sons of Liberty will get you fed. Pick a side.
Welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side, and we're talking with author and playwright Ptrick Gabridge. And today we've been talking about a couple of his plays, and we're going to be continuing talking about them. But I don't want people getting the notion that you're just a Bostonian writer, because we've talked about performing at MIT, a play at MIT, and then writing a Boston history play and performing it at the Old State House. So let's go on a journey around the world a bit, and let's talk about Fire on Earth, which is a fascinating, fascinating play.
Sure, yeah. So that's a play about it's about the English Reformation and the creation of the English Bible, which sounds a little dry, but it's really about some of these men who were willing to risk their lives for their beliefs, and both political and religious beliefs, at a time when oppression by the state and religion was extremely violent and severe.
Now,
So
I just have to clarify for those of you who haven't seen the play or are not that familiar with the history, that we're not talking about the King James Bible. That comes later. We're talking about the original translation of the Bible into English, which it had been translated into the vulgar languages or the common languages of a couple other countries before that. But this was one of the major goals of the Protestant Reformation, was to make the Bible accessible to everyone. And that's actually something that continues down to the modern day and that's part of what the Bible churches, if you see a church that says Bible church, that's really part of what that tradition is, that each and every one of us should read. And of course the church, the Catholic Church, which was the church of the time, and the monarchies, which owed so much fealty to and got so much support from being ordained by God, were opposed to that. The Bible was supposed to be written in Latin and only understood by the church scholars, and even the priests really didn't have that good a knowledge of the language.
right.
So this is a big, big change. So let's pick up from there so people know.
Right, and so this is in the 1520s and 1530s is when all this is happening. And yeah, so the vernacular had already spread to Germany and parts of Western Europe, and but yeah, England had really managed to seal off its borders pretty well. There had been a handwritten translation a century earlier, but never a printed English translation. So this guy, William Tyndale, decided he wanted to do it. And so he was a scholar. He'd asked for permission from the bishops, and they're like, no way, we cannot have that right now. So he ends up going into exile in Europe and various places, trying to smuggle this, to both write it, print it, and smuggle it. And so he ends up, the play is about William Tyndale and one of his key assistants, John Frith, and then another assistant, John Tewkesbury. And John Tewkesbury in this play is kind of our main character, and he's kind of a composite of a few reformers who are historical. But what the church was doing, and when I came across this story, I really didn't know this time period at all. I had spent some time working on a play in the 1600s, and so I knew a little bit about the Reformation in Europe, but didn't understand that in England, the church was actually collecting Bibles and burning them on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. When I read that, I was like,
and burning people.
And then moved on to burning people. So they started with burning the Bibles and thousands of them. And when that wasn't enough, they started burning the people who possessed them, who were printing them, and they actively hunted for Tyndale throughout his life. And it was just so mind-boggling to me that this. And I grew up in the Catholic Church, so I was just trying to wrap my head around this faith that I had once belonged to, and trying to understand how and why both that people would do this to each other over, a scripture that preaches something that, I thought of as a peaceful doctrine, and that who would be willing, like these people, weren't caught by accident. These people were willing to give their lives for their beliefs. And I'm really interested in people who are willing to make that commitment to each other, to their faith, and say, I'm willing to sacrifice myself in horrible ways. I mean, being burned at the stake is not a pleasant way to go.
There's another character I want to talk about who's in the play but isn't in the play. But before we get to him, I wanted to say there were some significant differences or issues in the translation. And one of them has to do with faith, hope, and...
Right, charity. Faith, hope, and charity, faith, hope, and love. That's a pretty big difference, right? So a lot of it, money is definitely a factor. So the church depended upon donations, incoming in order to fund itself, obviously. And in one of Paul's letters, he says, one of these most important things is faith, hope, and charity, or faith, hope, and love, and it depends on how you translate it. Right. The Protestants were translating this word as love rather than charity, and they felt they had a pretty strong case. And this is going back all the way to Martin Luther. which seems to cut off a pretty big income stream from the church.
Yeah, today, of course, people get around that by saying, oh, well, we're talking about charity to other people and, my good works. But that's not what it really was about. It was about if you wanted to get to heaven, you had to have faith, you had to hope in the Lord's salvation, because you certainly were not entitled to it, and you had to pay at the gate, as it were,
Yes.
by tithing, by giving to. And of course, it wasn't just the church, by the way. Remember, I said earlier, from a historical perspective, that the monarchy is dependent on the church for its legitimacy, and
Right.
and that charity or that giving was supposed to also include the debt you owed the monarch. The throne.
Right, exactly. They work together, and at this time period, this is the time of Henry VIII,
Right.
England. So his power is. He wants to consolidate his power. He's not getting what he wants in his personal life, so he decides, probably unwisely, depending on how you look at it, or wisely, he decides to make a major break with the church, and he's going to break the Catholic Church and form the Church of England. So there's a lot going on politically, and it's kind of an irony with the English reformers of the 20s and 30s is that they, in a way, they come a little too early, because if they'd come 5 years later, they wouldn't have been killed by the church, by the monarchy.
Yeah.
They would have been protected. They wouldn't have gone into exile. They wouldn't have been hunted down. A whole bunch of things wouldn't have had to happen to them.
Yeah.
But you could argue that they're at the very end. What's interesting is actually it ties into some of this other work that I've done around the American Revolution, that I think the reformers, especially in England, they're making some really interesting. Their battle that essentially says we have the right to believe what we want, we have the right to print what we want. That's at the heart of kind of the American Revolution.
Yeah, freedom of the press.
I mean, this sowing the
freedom
seeds
of the press is very important.
freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and this is at the heart of the immigrants who are going to leave England in the late 1600s and early 1700s. These are Tyndale's, have been, their beliefs have been seeded by Tyndale and those guys all the way back in the 1500s.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned earlier a character who is very much in the play but not in the play, and of course I'm talking about Thomas More.
Right.
And I love the way you dealt with More, and I wanted you to talk a little about that.
Right. So in my play, Thomas More appears only very briefly. Well, he's not a character all the way. He used to be more so in an old version of this play, but yeah, so he's a puppet. They use the characters, give a sense of what his writings are, and he's just a hand puppet in this play. And in a way, it's a response to Robert Bolton's play,
Man for All Seasons.
Man for All Seasons, which is just maddening to me and interesting to me in that he's created a play that I think in our collective imagination, also thanks to the film Man for All Seasons 2, helped create a modern depiction of Thomas More that is grossly inaccurate.
Rather at odds with the reality of the mean-spirited, bigoted approach he had to those who disagreed with him.
Right. I mean, he was hateful and, actually tortured people in his own house and pressed for their execution. So there was a certain fascination on my part of how can this be, and how does the Catholic Church canonize someone who is, guilty of torture? And there's all kinds of justifications for that, but it's disconcerting, but it's also important to know, and it's important to understand that history isn't as simple as it's often given to us. And I think that's the real importance and potential of studying history, to understand where we are now, and that we can wake up a little bit and say, oh, well, even though we've accepted this myth, we don't have to. And we may want to make changes once we know what the truth is. The problem is, once you know the truth about history and where things come from, you're confronted with a choice. Up until that point, when you only knew the myth, You can proceed blithely, and it doesn't really matter. But once you know, whether it's from seeing a play or reading a book or becoming informed in some way, then you're obligated to make a choice.
And that is one of the great goals of good expository drama writing, is like your plays. When I finished reading Fire on Earth, I had seen A Man for All Seasons in Broadway when it first opened.
Oh, that's cool.
It was a powerful, powerful play.
Yeah, it's a good play.
Like, woo. On the other hand, while I could appreciate the power of the character, I did see him as rather stiff-necked and authoritarian, and I knew enough to question, but it was a very powerful play. And then when I read Fire on Earth, I said, gee, you know what I would love is if we could get a group that does back-to-back. Like the American Theater Company, I think it is, this year, did Julius Caesar and then a play about Malcolm X. And they performed it back-to-back. My wife and I went to see, they were here in Phoenix, my wife and I went. Beautifully done, 2 fabulous productions. And you're left really thinking about not just the historical facts, as you were talking, but the intellectual meaning of the ideas. And I would love to see Fire on Earth in repertory with A Man for All Seasons, wouldn't you?
Me too. Oh man, I would kill for that doubleheader. That would be amazing. Even if it was just a reading, to read them back to back. It would be interesting just as an artist just to hear one response to the other. For me, it would be amazing. Yeah, if you want to make that happen, I'm on board.
I'll try out here anyway. Anyway, folks, we'll be right back with some more with Ptrick Gabridge.
Hi, Randy.
Is that Randy?
It's fine, Linda. I've got it.
Close the door, for Christ's sakes, it's January.
Hi, Charles. Trick or treat.
He's too old anyway. Tell him Halloween is over and it's freezing outside. Donna is not coming back. Tell him to grow up.
So, Randy, we all miss him.
One more time?
Happy Halloween.
Thanks. See you tomorrow.
And welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. And Ptrick, I wanted to switch now to, because we're kind of in this field of God and religion. And the 4th play that you were kind enough to send me is Reading the Mind of God, which is something I guess we all want to do. And that's not just reading and interpreting the Bible, but the mind of God is, I guess, to be found in the very essence of the world around us. At least that is what those of us who have grown up in the modern world believe. We tend to see the scientific connection, the mathematical reality, and by the way, that brings up one of my personal great heroes. I don't know if you've ever thought about writing a play about a guy named Spinoza.
Oh, interesting. I haven't thought about that, but he definitely is an interesting guy to write about.
One of my favorite characters, and also very interesting from a religious perspective to make this transition. Spinoza was originally intended to become the head rabbi of the Netherlands. He of course, was a Sephardic Jew, and he was the golden-haired boy of the Jewish community there until he raised this question about God and removed the personalized God and said, okay, what we're really talking about is the mathematical nature of God as revealed in science. And he went on to becoming one of the world's premier lens grinders. He loved the idea that in grinding a lens, that one could in some way find a perfection. And of,
Right.
and of course that leads us right into the subject of telescopes in astronomy and reading the mind of God.
Right. So this play is about the astronomers Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe, and this is in the year 1600. So this is actually just as telescopes are about to be invented. So it's slightly before. And it's, even though it seems to be a play about astronomy, it's really about a play about, one, it's about scientists and about ego, very much so. About, these are two men who are both pretty sure they're pretty smart.
Right.
Tycho is the older, more experienced scientist.
And a politician, too.
A bit of a politician, but maybe not a very good one. But the most famous astronomer in the world, and really interested in cementing his place in history. And young Johannes Kepler comes along, who is a Protestant trying to survive in Germany during the Reformation, really having a hard time during the 100 Years' War. So ends up kind of in exile, coming to Tycho's castle and trying to work with him. And he has just published some really important books with theories that promise to be revolutionary. And Tycho knows already before he arrives, and more so even after he arrives, that this man is a genius. And what bothers Tycho about him is that he knows he's going to be eclipsed by Kepler.
Yeah.
And it is so hard for him to let him in. And what Johannes Kepler knows is that Tycho has this treasure trove of scientific observation. And this is just getting to the point where Copernicus made his theories around planetary motion in the solar system early and without a lot of observation. And what Tycho had done was he had observed the sky and carefully recorded his observations for 30 plus years. And so he had data. And so what this really is, it's a play also about the emergence of data as importance for science. And Kepler knows this. Kepler is nearsighted. Watching the stars is potentially interesting for him, but he can't really do it very well. But what he can do is he can make theories and he can use information and math better than anybody in the world at that time. Definitely on par, I would say, with someone who's soon to come, and that's Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton may be a step ahead.
But on the other hand, Newton
sheer genius. But it's Isaac Newton is using Kepler's data and laws and Tycho's data as well to come up with his laws. But Kepler's laws,
folks, it wasn't just an apple falling on his head.
It was not an apple falling on his head. And Newton realized as much. He said, "If I have seen farther than others, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants." And those giants are Kepler and Tycho, particularly are people he's interested in, especially Kepler. Kepler has a lot of wild ideas, but he salivates practically over this data that Tycho has collected, and Tycho does not want to give it up because he knows if he does, history will not remember him. So it's about this battle in a way inside this older man, which I think is really something we can all watch in our daily lives. What happens when you're the older guy, comes along and you know your protege is better than you, and are you willing to give him what he needs if it means the destruction of your legacy? And so it's a really, when we did it in Denver, this is an older play. It was very powerful, and audiences responded to it, and we've done it in front of thousands of people. It was just tremendous. We had a great show.
No, it's a wonderful play. I think that fascinating, there are two other themes that I felt were going through it that were fascinating. One is, of course, the argument that was going on around that time historically. Does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does everything revolve around the Earth?
Right.
And the other one that is still playing out in the world today is the role of astrology.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so in terms of what revolves around what, there is an interesting. It was hard to. It's not so easy to prove, and especially the instruments they had in 1600, exactly what's going around what. And plus, it also depends on your perspective a little bit, right?
And the question is Tycho revolving around Kepler, or is Kepler revolving around Tycho?
Exactly. Yes.
And then we have this other little errant kind of circle that's going around, which is Tycho's assistant.
Yep.
And another one is his son. So you have, who's revolving around whom?
Yes, Tycho has many people in his orbit that he would like to keep revolving around him.
Yeah.
In his daughter, his son, this assistant, and his son is a disappointment to him because he's not an astronomer, and he recognizes that his son is not at all what he wanted. I mean, Kepler is his, essentially his adopted son by the very end, because he's the person capable both of destroying his legacy but also carrying it on at the same time. And as for astrology, they did not split them up so much, and there were definitely felt that the stars had influence on the world around them. And Kepler was court astrologer to the Emperor Rudolph and a few other people, so that's how he made his living.
Yeah.
It was hard to make a living as a scientist, but people that had money wanted you to tell them what was going to happen, and I think he believed in it to an extent too. I don't know if they saw this clear separation that we now come to see, but it was interesting. It was an interesting time.
If you start out with the view that the world is entirely planned out and run by God, and that God is giving us ways to know that plan, then clearly astrology makes a lot of sense.
It could.
Assumptions.
Right. Except if you follow the quantum entanglement that we were talking about earlier, what you realize is that we don't live in a deterministic universe, we live in a probabilistic universe. Right. And that's kind of what quantum physics shows us is that a probabilistic universe is unlikely, just because of the way, at least in the micro scale, because we can't know, things aren't determined ahead of time. Right. If that makes sense.
Well, probability theory comes along, and we start following probability, using probability, and it allows us to do a great deal and learn a great deal and understand a great deal, but it does take away from that wonderful sense of certainty.
Oh, yes.
That we want, and that's one of the themes, I think, that kind of runs through a lot of your work, is the sense that we want certainty. We want to know what's absolutely right. Mm-hmm. But reality is that there's often two or more than two sides to a story, and knowing what's right is a lot more difficult than we want to admit to as humans.
Good. That makes me very happy that you feel that. And I think that is borne up. I think if you look at Blood on the Snow, it's unclear what decision they should take. If they take the right one, I think with Fire on Earth, it is hard to know who's right or wrong. I mean, in some ways, the play is pretty strongly in favor of at least letting people express their opinions, for sure. But they're all taking risks, for sure. And reading the mind of God, it's the same way. It's never easy to know, and you have to take risks.
I think one of the themes that I take away from your stuff, of course this is my filtering it through my mind, is that we only can know if we take risks, and we can only take risks if we know we don't know. That's
the hardest thing. And I think, yes, certainty is dangerous. I think is a absolute certainty is probably not a safe thing for people to have, because once they're certain, they can start taking actions without consequence. So, because that's true of the bishops in Fire on Earth, they're willing to burn people in the stake because they're certain that doing so is God's will. Perhaps. I mean, they have other ambitions and the like, but they've convinced themselves of this certainty.
They have convinced themselves with certainty.
Right.
And that brings up as we're hitting the very end, that I think one of the reasons I love plays, I love theater. I go to theater. I've written a couple short little things. Someday maybe I'll write more. But one of the reasons I love theater is that I think it reminds us to raise questions like that about our human condition. Good theater brings the human condition into the lens of the theater goer.
I agree. I think it focuses that, and it's done collectively. We do it as a group. So it's a thing that, there's the death of theater has been written about many times, but I don't think it's going anywhere. And more so given modern technology, where it's great we can see movies or TV anytime we want, but it's not the same thing as being in a theater and going through this collective experience and then being left with these questions all together, and having shared this thing that has happened to us and around us. That, I think, actually becomes more precious in our modern era, where we can be a little distanced from each other by technology. We gain a great amount of information through the internet and YouTube and videos and all that stuff, which is great, but we don't gain connection in that ability to have those questions felt deeply within us. And I think that is where we see the strength of theater.
And thank you very much, Ptrick Gabridge, for joining me today on Walking on the Weene Side. It has really been a pleasure having you as my guest.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey, buddy. Game's over. Time to go home.
Trying to make the moment last.
It's January. Ballpark's closed. Players are all home and clean shaven.
I can still hear the crowd. I can still see Yui Hara thrusting his glove in the air.
Yeah, still gives me chills.
Makes me feel all warm inside.
Well, it ain't warm out here. Now look, you can't stay.
It's the one place where things make sense. Balls are either fair or foul. Players are either safe or out.
It's a jack-off bump calls interference.
It was in the rules. Bad call, but it was right. Out there, people blow up crowds at the marathon. Bosses lay off people by the hundreds. Maybe a guy's wife says she's leaving him. His kids say they hate him. I'm not sure what the rules are anymore. Maybe nothing makes sense.
Except right here.
Still hear the crack of the ball off Victorino's bat.
Yeah.